Carol is the George Winfree Professor of American History and Scholar in Residence of the Richards Civil War Era Center at Penn State University. Her teaching and research focus is on various aspects of American military and naval history. Carol also serves on the board of the Gettysburg Foundation's Historians Council and our board of directors. She has authored several major publications, including her latest book with co-author retired Colonel Tom Vossler, entitled A Field Guide to Gettysburg, Experiencing the Battlefield Through Its History, Places, and People. It won the 2013 Batchelder Coddington Prize for the best book on the Gettysburg campaign, published during the sesquicentennial year. Also, she has been selected as the 2015-2016 Penn State University Laureate. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Reardon.
Carol.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. All together now. Hello. We have to do these things right. Well, I decided to take a little break from my usual discussions of military strategy and military thinking and fall back on part of my historical education that I haven't used in a long time. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar how we get to have that beautiful thud that comes after our name, we usually have to have a committee that represents 4 different fields, 4 different historical specialties. Those of us who are Civil War historians often have Civil War or military history as one of our fields, but we have to have 3 others: American history in general or European history. Well, one of mine was the history of science, medicine, and technology. That goes back to my younger days when, as an undergraduate at Allegheny College, I actually have a bachelor's degree in biology. I didn't start out to do what it is I do today. But every now and then, I sort of hear the siren song of biology calling me home, and this is where this started. Now, over the course of the last year, as I was serving as the university laureate, I visited all 20 of the branch campuses of Penn State University, and I also got called to the medical school. I was very interested to learn that Penn State's medical school up at Hershey has a humanities department. It was one of the first medical schools in the country to have a humanities department to make sure that the future doctors of America still had some contact and some context for the people with whom they would be dealing. They have a history of science or a history of medicine lecture program, and I got a chance to go up and talk to them. And basically what you're going to get today will be a version of that presentation. The cool thing about it was they were so interested in the topic that after I went up and talked to them up in Hershey, the very next day, 50 of them got on a bus and came down here. We took them over to the Seminary Ridge Museum and showed them the best possible circumstances that a physician at Gettysburg would have to deal with in the aftermath of the battle. And then, of course, with the assistance of a few good folks here from the Gettysburg Foundation, we took them over to the George Spangler Farm, and we let them see what it was more likely a surgeon at Gettysburg was going to have to deal with. And as they stood there looking at it, I was wondering how they were reacting to it. And one of them said, you know, it might seem like we were looking at a complete disconnect. For those of us who are fortunate to work in a modern hospital in our futures, this might not have a whole lot of relevance. But for those of us who might find ourselves serving in the military, or who might go off on a humanitarian mission, or who might end up being assigned to some kind of emergency trauma situation in a mass casualty, after a mass casualty event, we might be performing meatball surgery, as they like to say on the old MASH series. We might have to work under circumstances that are not tremendously different than what you can see on the Spangler Farm today. We have a lot of tools, but we might have to work in an environment that would be as hostile as the Spangler Farm was back in 1863. So they were making some interesting connections that I really hadn't thought of to begin with. And all of a sudden, I've sort of developed a whole new respect for Civil War medicine that I hadn't had because I just hadn't thought about it for a long time. But one of the things I did learn back when I was a student of the history of science and medicine and technology was that it was a standard issue belief that modern American medicine was a product of the late 19th century. It was a product of the 1880s and the 1890s. After germ theory had established itself, after the chemical-based pharmaceuticals began to kick in. Once the big teaching hospitals like Johns Hopkins and those began to be established, that's where you could date the beginnings of a professional American military community, American medical community. The more modern studies on a Civil War era medicine have changed the way we look at that. And if you're looking for a new book, a fairly new book to read, about Civil War era medicine, and if it's not on your shelf, I recommend highly that you pick up a copy of Shauna Devine's book, Learning from the Wounded, and give that a very good read. There's a lot of interesting material in it. So basically what I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about Civil War medicine, and sticking with the theme of everything new starts from the Civil War. Take a look at some of the interesting things we can learn. Probably one of the great unheralded heroes of Civil War era medicine is this man, Surgeon General William Hammond. William Hammond was born in Maryland but was raised in the area around Harrisburg. He went to medical school. There weren't many medical schools at the time, but he went to New York University's medical school and went right straight into the United States Army and served as a military surgeon. He stuck with it for a while, but finally, about 1860, he returned to civilian life because he found the medical environment in the Army a bit too restrictive. He had imagination. He had a degree of intellectual interest. He had far more than the Army medical system could take into account. He wanted to go out and experiment and try new things. So he joined the medical staff in Baltimore, and that's where he was when the Civil War broke out. When the Civil War broke out, the Surgeon General of the United States was a man by the name of Clement Finley, and Dr. Finley had perhaps been a fairly good doctor in his youth, but he was approaching retirement age, and he was completely overwhelmed by the scope of the crisis that he now had to deal with. He didn't know how to establish any kind of a system for the care, short-term or long-term, of mass casualties. After the experience of the Union Army at First Bull Run, where most of the wounded were taken care of by regimental hospitals who would only admit the wounded from their own regiment, even if there was a stream of badly wounded soldiers coming in from other regiments. It just wasn't a system that worked very well. It was pretty clear early on that Finley was not going to be up to the challenge. And in early 1862, he went into retirement, and Surgeon General William Hammond stepped onto the scene. Like a new broom that sweeps clean from the very start, from the moment he showed up, Hammond came in with a plan. And he began, every day there seemed to be a new project for him to tackle. One of the first things he did was to raise the standards for those who would be permitted to practice medicine within the military. One of the things that he was very concerned about was the fact that the United States had no system for medical education. There were those, especially in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, sort of the age of Andrew Jackson and the aftermath, where if you wanted to become a doctor, all you had to do was to attend a series of lectures. I once ran into this one. I actually saw the book. It was a book of tickets you could go out and purchase, and each one of those tickets would admit you to a lecture. And you would go to the lecture and turn in your ticket and listen to the lecture, and then when you walked out, assuming you had turned in your ticket, well, then you were now a master of that information. At the end of the course, all you did was to turn in your empty book that had no more tickets sitting in it, and you would trade your empty book for basically a diploma saying that you were a doctor. If that doesn't sound really bad, I don't know what does. Well, not every bit of medical training was quite that bad. There were plenty of established medical schools, but mostly they were lecture-based. There was very little clinical practice. It was entirely possible to go through an entire course of study without ever having seen an autopsy, without ever dissecting a human body. You might have watched a body being dissected, but you probably did not have opportunity yourself to pick up a scalpel and try it out for yourself. You probably never figured out what the prescription for a medicine should be or write out a prescription for one. An awful lot of the things that we think of as standard operating procedure today were not even part of medical education back at the time. The best American physicians, the best instructors at American medical schools were invariably those who had decided early on in their career that the United States was no place to get a medical education in the first place. And what they had decided, pretty much as a group, was they had to go overseas. Back in the era of the American Revolution, it was not uncommon for an American who really wanted to practice the medical profession to go to London or to Edinburgh in Scotland and to learn much more about medical science there. For the generation leading up to the American Civil War, Paris was the place to go. Already in Berlin, over in Germany, there were some signs that there was going to be perhaps a challenger to Paris's preeminence, but that hadn't quite happened yet. And Paris offered a couple of things that American medical education did not. One of the things that they had in profusion somehow, some way, were bodies, dead bodies on which you could actually go and study anatomy up close and personal. A chart just doesn't cut it after a certain point. You have to go in and see how the muscles and how the veins and arteries and how the nerves interact with each other. You have to get the hands-on experience. You could do that in Paris. You could not do it here, by the way, because almost every state in the Union had very strict laws against stealing corpses and things like that. And rather than to run the risk of going to prison, by and large, medical education just worked without those things. But apparently they didn't have such qualms in France. And invariably, you could get a lot more practical experience. They also did a lot more clinical work over in Paris, where you could work in a hospital environment, where you could learn sort of a systematic thing, where you could work with other very experienced physicians, where you could take a single disease and see its symptoms presented in a variety of different ways, so that there wasn't, you didn't have in your mind one way and one way only, and some variant might throw off your diagnosis completely. Paris was the place to be, and Hammond had been one of the ones who had gone to Paris. So one of the first things he did, as he's trying to develop a system for the United States Army medical establishment, is that he was going to make sure that the key personnel, the key people, the key leaders at the various military posts and hospitals that he was planning to establish would be Paris-educated physicians. He would expect them not just to be excellent practitioners, but he was going to expect them to be teachers as well. And so from the very start, and he was very deeply and very personally involved in the interview process. He made sure he had the best people in place. And once he did, he backed off and let them do their thing. He was not a micromanager. You put good people in place and then you let them roll with it. And he was by and large very successful at doing such things. One of the things he also encouraged his very best doctors to do is to play to their strengths. Today, whenever we have whatever physical malady might bother us, we might begin with a general practitioner, but then we end up in the hands of a specialist. Back in the 1860s, most physicians didn't even really have a concept of what a medical specialty might be. But he did. Hammond did. In fact, his own was neurology. In some quarters, William Hammond is considered the father of American neurological studies. And he would encourage his physicians to pick the kind of wound, pick the kind of injury, pick the part of the body that interested you the most, and become a specialist in that regard. And that way, if they came across a specific case that was particularly challenging, they had a roster, a list of experts in that field, and they knew how to make the best use of the knowledge that they had. There were very few things that escaped Hammond's attention. If he heard about a medical practice that he thought showed some promise, he encouraged it. If he heard about a medical practice that he thought was dangerous, he would go out of his way to try to get it banned. And in fact, that got him in trouble in one regard. There was a very common treatment back during the Civil War era that called for the use of calomel. Now, calomel is a mercury derivative, and it was used for a lot of different things. It was used as a laxative. It was used as a disinfectant. It was used as a treatment for syphilis, among other things. But if you did not use it right, A, it could kill you, B, it could make your hair fall out, C, it could make your teeth fall out. There's D, E, and F, and we don't even need to go there. It just wasn't a good thing. But one of the things that Hammond said is, we're not going to use Calomel anymore. But it was such a standard thing that a whole lot of his own practitioners stood up and said, well, I've used it all my life, and I'm going to keep using it, until he kind of sternly looked at him and said, no, you're not. Okay. And they quit using it. But there was so much pushback that that would be one of the things that ultimately would lead to his resignation in 1864. There will be many things that Hammond will be known for establishing, and one of them will be a system of military hospitals. Before the Civil War, there were a number of small naval hospitals established for the United States Navy, but they were small, usually didn't have room for more than 20 patients. They were designed for the long-term care of United States naval personnel who had gotten ill overseas and needed long-term care. One of the things that they noticed was that most men who joined the Navy were away from home for so long that many of them did not come back to a traditional family-based support system, didn't have families to take them in, and that's why the hospitals had to exist. The Army hadn't had that problem before, and now Hammond is going to do something about it. One of the most famous hospitals, of course, was the Satterlee Hospital, named for its surgeon, its chief surgeon, Dr. Satterlee. This hospital, at its peak, would have beds for over 4,500 patients. And as you can see, it's organized into long wards. And those wards would each contain would contain patients that all pretty much have the same kinds of injuries. It provided doctors with an opportunity to look at a whole lot of different kinds of leg wounds, or different kinds of arm wounds, or different kinds of diseases, bad cases of dysentery. It gave you an opportunity not just to learn, but to compare. And it also allowed for the generation of some kinds of data. And that would be an important element of medical education as far as Hammond was concerned. When you went to the hospitals, you could see all kinds of different sites. And one of the diseases that bothered an awful lot of physicians early on, of course, was this whole notion of gangrene. They did not know a whole lot about gangrene or what caused it or how to take care of it. And there was actually, at the time, a very lively debate in the medical circles, both here in the United States and in Europe, about the best way to take care of it. What Hammond basically said was, here on a ward, we might have 30 different cases. And what we can do is we can figure out, we can try some different kinds of treatments. We can change the doses. We can keep them under observation. And at least we will have a foundation of hard data that we can rest upon to figure out what works, what doesn't work, what seems promising, what clearly didn't lead us anywhere. And he insisted not only that such experimentation would go on, but that records would be kept and that data would be generated. And research and experimentation became part of medical education in the United States. It sounds very modern in its own way, and it was. The one piece that, of course, wasn't part of all this was they didn't take into account an awful lot of what today we would call HIPAA rights. They didn't ask if the patient was okay with being part of any of these experiments or anything of the sort. If you were in the hospital, you were a test case, and that's all there was to it. But certainly there's an awful lot to be considered here. Not only are we going to talk about different kinds of bromine and bromides that can be used with gangrene, there was an awful lot of questions when it came to amputations. Not just whether or not to amputate, but the kind of cut you wanted to make, the kind of stump you wanted to prepare, the kind of prosthetics that might work best for individuals, all kinds of questions that had to be tested, debated, resolved, if you could. One of the things that Hammond realized early on was that the federal budget, even in wartime, was never going to be able to give him all the assets that he needed to provide the degree of care that he wanted to give to American soldiers, to Union soldiers. And so, to an unprecedented degree, he opened up the care of the American wounded to the greater American population. He understood early on that when the United States went to war in 1861, it wasn't just the Army that went to war. It was the whole American nation, the whole American people. And so he actively encouraged civilian-based groups, not just random volunteer individuals. He worked with organized groups that could provide some of the things that the federal government couldn't do for him. So he worked, among others, with the United States Sanitary Commission. Sanitary Commission was based in New York, where they could gather a whole lot of money, and of course they could gather a whole lot of volunteers, and they were able to provide all kinds of things. That might be creating a database of their own, probably a bunch of file cards, but a list of doctors who would be available for volunteer service in an emergency situation. It might provide transportation to get those doctors from their hometowns to where they would be needed. It might help to provide, one of the things that they provided a great deal was food. According to Army Surgical Department regulations, there was a certain prescribed diet that individual wounded and sick soldiers were supposed to have. But it was a little heavy on protein and carbohydrates and very light on fruits and vegetables and things with the vitamins and the other nutrients that you need. And there was no money in the budget to get those good things that you sort of needed to have. Oftentimes it was the United States Sanitary Commission that would step in and buy all of those nutritional supplements that were needed to support the hospitals. And often enough, they went and bought all the other kinds of food that were needed as well. Sometimes they worked with the Army, sometimes they worked with the hospitals. But one of the things that they're going to focus a great deal on is providing basic nutrition to the Army well beyond hardtack and salt pork. In addition to the Sanitary Commission, there was, of course, the Christian Commission. The Christian Commission provided many of the same services that the Sanitary Commission did, but they also tended to provide some spiritual support as well. They could provide chaplains, they could provide extra nurses, they could provide an awful lot of spiritual support. Many times it would be representatives of the Christian Commission who would circulate in the hospitals and take those, write those last letters home, send the last words home to loving families back in Maine or Wisconsin or somewhere else, to let families know that in their last moments their warriors were thinking of them. The Christian Commission did not limit themselves by any stretch of the imagination to simply the spiritual. In certain times when there was a specific need. For instance, well, on the peninsula back in 1862, there were an awful lot of sick and wounded soldiers after McClellan's Peninsula campaign, and there simply wasn't enough infrastructure to set up hospitals to take care of them. It was decided that these men would be removed to some of these new hospitals that Hammond had created in places like Baltimore and New York City and Philadelphia. But the problem was one of transportation. How do we get them from that peninsula on the James River all the way up to Philadelphia or New York or somewhere like that? It would not be the United States Navy that would run to resolve this situation. It would instead be the Christian Commission and the Sanitary Commission who would rent ships, make sure that they were clean, provide for crews, provide the food, provide the bedding, and make it possible to remove sick and wounded soldiers from the peninsula and take them for longer-term care back up to the north. Hammond never missed an opportunity to sing the praises of the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission. He thought they did incredibly important work that his own department should be doing but did not have the assets to do themselves. He recognized that the challenge facing him was just far bigger than he could handle just within the confines of the United States Army. Now, Hammond is going to be the man who's going to spend most of his time in Washington, and he'll be the one who thinks strategically. How do I make the entire medical system work? But of course, when we think about medicine during the Civil War, we most often think about what happens at a place like Gettysburg, when after a couple of days of fighting, we have thousands and thousands of casualties that require some kind of medical attention. How do we take care of that? And of course, the person we know best, especially in our here at Gettysburg, is Dr. Jonathan Letterman. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, in fact, became known as the father of battlefield medicine. He too is a native of Pennsylvania, born in Canonsburg area, went to Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, and then he decided to serve as a physician in the United States Army beginning in 1949. Beginning in 1862, especially after the first Bull Run debacle, he was the one who began to work as the medical director of the Army of the Potomac to try to figure out different ways to improve medical care. He would have some ideas. He'd always run them up against Surgeon General Hammond, and Hammond almost always said, run with it. If you think if you've identified a problem and you think you have a solution, you go ahead and you do it. One of the very first things that Letterman is going to tackle is the very simple issue of removing wounded from the battlefield to a place where they could get some care. That meant ambulances. When the Civil War broke out, there were ambulances, but they were awfully creaky things and not very stable. When you take a look at a lot of pictures of ambulances, you'll notice that they have two wheels. Now, if you think about any vehicle on two wheels, think about your wheelbarrow at home. You know that those things are not very stable. Not just that they might tip over, but sometimes they're pointing up in the air, sometimes they're tilting down like that. They aren't level. That constant motion up and down was really hard on patients, especially if they had wounded limbs, and it was very painful, and frankly, they weren't working very well. One of the first things that Letterman is going to do is going to basically ask all of his senior medical personnel for input on what would the ideal ambulance look like. He also had been trained in Paris. He had seen what the French army had developed during the Crimean War. He had checked to see what several different foreign militaries did, and he early on became an advocate of an ambulance that had four wheels. One that is very stable, one that actually has springs in it so it can bounce over hard roads and the patients do not get jostled very well. If you have a chance while you're in Gettysburg and you visit the Seminary Ridge Museum, take a look at their model of an ambulance wagon that's right outside the building right now. And you'll see the kind of ambulance that Letterman approved. It seems just like a plain old wagon with four wheels, and it really isn't much more than that, but it was such an improvement over what they had that physicians and soldiers themselves marveled at what seemed to be a revolutionary improvement in just the simple act of removing a wounded soldier from the battlefield and taking him to the next place. That next place, of course, was going to be some kind of a battlefield hospital. We have some aid stations that are fairly close to the front line. There usually wasn't a system to them. It was the regimental surgeon or assistant surgeon just simply setting up behind a rock saying, come over here, I'll slap a Band-Aid on whatever's bleeding right now. If you're hanging around Gettysburg as long as I have, you know to go out near the Irish Brigade Memorial. Go right across the road from the Irish Brigade Memorial. Go behind and look behind and find the rock that has a tablet on it. And it's a tablet to one of the surgeons who established a field aid station. But very few soldiers are going to stay there very long. That's just sort of a gathering place for the wounded. From there, you hope that the ambulances are going to be able to come in and take you farther away from behind the line. What Letterman will decide fairly early on is that in order to get the best care to the most people, you don't want to have a regimental hospital for just every regiment, but instead to establish hospitals on the division or the corps level. The Spangler Farm that we had here was a division hospital first, and then it became the whole 11th Corps Hospital. But this was a system that made an awful lot of sense to Letterman. You could concentrate your expertise, you could concentrate your supplies, and you could more expeditiously go through a whole lot of casualties and figure out who you could save, who can wait, who might be saved if we work on them immediately, and who can't be saved at all. Today, of course, we talk about the term triage, and it's Letterman who's pretty much the one who is going to develop that as a standard practice, at least in the Eastern armies for the Union Army in the Civil War. There will be similar developments out in the West, but Letterman will do it here in the East. For some soldiers, there wasn't anything that could be done. And Letterman knew that there were some, even who made it back to his hospitals, that he couldn't do anything for. But he committed himself for working as hard as he possibly could for those who might be saved. What we see at Gettysburg is actually something that he has already tried. We talk about Letterman and what he does here without always providing a lot of context. Letterman had been the medical director for the Army of the Potomac during the summer campaigns in the peninsula the year before. And when McClellan took over the command of the new reorganized Army of the Potomac for the Antietam campaign, he told Letterman to continue in that position. Taking a look at what Letterman does between September 2nd, when he is appointed medical director of the new reorganized Army of the Potomac, and the Battle of Antietam on the 17th, is really a wondrous thing to explore. As he followed the armies from the outskirts of Washington into the western part of Maryland, he began to take into account every large public building he passed. When he reached Frederick, Maryland, there were already a couple of hospitals established. Well, he went and he looked and identified some additional ones that could be turned into hospitals very quickly if the need came. When he got to Middletown, he looked around. When he got to the outskirts of Sharpsburg, he visited every small farm, every area he could, the day before the battle was even fought, and identified a great number of potential hospital sites. He actually had conversation with all the Corps medical directors, and they talked to their division medical directors. Even before the first shots were fired for the Battle of Antietam, Letterman had basically already outlined a system of hospitals that could be used. When the battle began, there were aid stations right behind the lines, of course, but as the wounded began to fall back, there wasn't a whole lot of confusion about where these soldiers should go. Already the word had filtered out. We don't know a whole lot about that process of filtering the word to the people in the front line about where to go, but it happened pretty smoothly. Even at the area around Sharpsburg did not remain a hospital for very long, because as soon as a patient could be moved, they were pulled back to Middletown or to Frederick or even to Washington, to larger hospitals where they could get better care, where the facilities were designed for the care of wounded soldiers. And the number of men who were wounded and could be saved with appropriate care was actually pretty significant. In other words, what Letterman had done was prepared a system that didn't require a local small community to bear all the brunt of medical care itself, but created a system to move the wounded that could be moved to a place where they could get the best possible care. What happens here at Gettysburg is essentially a repetition of what he tried out so successfully at Antietam. Many of the wounded that start out at various little hospitals around the various farms around here are not going to stay there very long. Even the folks over in the seminary are only going to be there until the middle of September, when they will be consolidated at Camp Letterman. And that's what you would find happening at many of the other hospitals on site. Spangler Farm is a hospital, but for 5 weeks, not forever, as we begin to have this process of consolidating medical care into smaller, fewer, but better facilities. He really had quite a system going. He also realized, much as Hammond did, that whenever you had a big battle, you had a manpower issue, you had a personnel issue, but it was going to be a short-term and temporary one, not a long-term one where you have to hire the best people who are going to serve for the entire war. And one of the things Letterman had to have was a way of mobilizing a medical force to take care of a crisis such as occurred here at Gettysburg. One of the things, of course, he has are the U.S. Army surgeons. The regiments themselves have surgeons and assistant surgeons appointed by their state governors. There was also a system of contract surgeons that the United States Army could hire on a short-term basis for a couple of months, for as long as needed. And of course, in the extreme, the call would go out for volunteer civilian surgeons. And from here in the area of south central Pennsylvania, extending from here around Harrisburg to Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, there would be a number of civilian doctors who would answer the call and come here. There had to be a system to figure out where they would go and what they would do, but that was something that Letterman would have in place. The call could go out and he could get the personnel together. The same would be true when it came to nursing, of course. So we all pretty much know the story about the nuns coming up from Emmitsburg and joining in the military effort here. You didn't want these people on your payroll all the time because the constant need wasn't there and the expense would be extreme. But whenever there was an emergency, what Letterman gives us is a system for identifying his immediate personnel needs and filling them and taking care of them. Now, one of the things, of course, that Letterman or any physician had to deal with was the fact that while there would certainly be spikes in medical needs right after a battle, there was always a need every day, 365 of the year. We know, of course, that in the Civil War, many more soldiers died of disease than died of wounds inflicted in battle. And of course, one of the things that you had to learn to take care of, as well as a bullet through the leg, was dysentery, diarrhea, typhoid fever, yellow fever, things like that. Since the Civil War was going to offer us examples of just about every disease known to North American medicine, Hammond decided it was very important that we use the Civil War as an opportunity to learn everything we possibly could. So in addition to taking care of the soldiers in the field, Hammond would insist on one other thing, and that was the creation of what he called simply the Army Medical Museum. And the Army Medical Museum was going to be established in Washington, and he appointed this man, Dr. John Brenton, rank of major, to head up this effort. Now, he too was a Pennsylvanian. Seems like there's an awful lot of Pennsylvanians involved in this military effort. But what he became was the curator of the Army Medical Museum. Now, he had a particularly interesting job. His job was to go to the hospitals after a battle and basically go around to the hospitals and sort of watch all the operations and say, that looks like an interesting one. Tell me about that operation. Oh, it's an unusual wound to the leg. It's not just a regular bullet through the leg. The bone's been broken into 3 sections. Ooh, what are you going to do with that? And then if it got to be really interesting, it sounds morbid, but I think Brenton got to the point where he kind of hoped that the patient died. Because what his job was to bring back specimens. His job was to actually go and find interesting cases that had an unusual presentation of a disease or represented an unusual twist on a familiar disease, and bring back some evidence that you could look at. And he wasn't all that picky. I mean, if it's one of those things that he needs to know something about head wounds in battle, he's going to go up and he's going to take a look at various and sundry individuals who have been wounded in the head, and he's going to say things like, okay, how did he get that wound? Oh, that was a saber cut. I already have 3 with saber cuts. Oh, that's a bayonet thrust. I want that one. And as soon as the guy dies, and again, without asking the family's permission or obviously the soldier's permission, that head's going to be removed and it's going to become a specimen in the Army Medical Museum. If there's an arm or a leg, that's one thing. But it went beyond simply bones. It's one of those things. If you had a soldier who had a particularly virulent case of dysentery, when he died, we want to know what happened to you internally. So let's dissect you and take a long piece of your descending big intestine, and we're going to spread it out with pins and put it on a nice big flat board. And so we want to be able to look at the lesions and all the holes in it and stuff like that. And we're going to do that to maybe 10 or 12 different ones so we can see how 12 different cases looked like. And it almost got to the point where they said that Brenton, or his ghouls, as they were invariably called, were going around saying, anybody got a good dysentery case? Yeah. Oh, come on, guys. Yeah. You'd think, you'd wish they'd be a little bit classier than that. But sometimes they came in search of a very specific thing. Yellow fever. Got anybody got a yellow fever here? Okay, not in Pennsylvania. Go to Louisiana. You'll pick them up down there. Brenton came to Gettysburg. He brought with him a team of about 30 individuals, and their job was not primarily, first and foremost, to take care of the wounded, but instead to go out and find specimens. And of course, one of the most famous specimens of all is Sickles' leg. When Sickles had his leg taken off, they asked him what did he want to have done with it, and he said, send it to the Army Medical Museum. They didn't even have to come looking for it. He offered it up. And we all know the stories about how he used to go and visit it and chat with it and all that kind of stuff. Now, you can still see Sickles' leg. It's now at the Army Medical Museum has become the National Museum of Medicine and Health, and it's in Silver Spring, Maryland. When I first saw General Sickles' leg, of course, everybody's looking at it, but it's in a cabinet full of other people's legs that have been hit with bullets and canister and all that kind of stuff. And I'm looking at Sickles' leg, and then somebody nudges me and says, look at this one. So I moved 2 legs over. It's the leg of Private John Reardon of the 6th New York Cavalry. At that point on, Sickles' leg really didn't matter to me very much because I began to obsess about whether or not this Reardon was a relation of mine. He's not. But it's an attention getter, no matter how you look at it. But you have all kinds of things to take a look at. Now, if all you have is a bunch of bones and a bunch of specimens to look at, that's one important thing. It's a step forward. It's moving toward what the Germans are actually developing in Berlin, where it's not just bodies you can dissect, but actually have a catalog of specimens, where you can go and take a look at how one disease might present itself in a lot of different ways. In order to take that and make it something that's accessible to every physician who can't maybe visit a museum, Hammond did one other thing. He sowed the seed for what became the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion. Now, some of you might actually have this in your library at home. If not, find somebody, make a friend with somebody who has a copy and go take a look at it. It's a 6-volume work. It usually appears in about 12 different volumes, but it was a 6-volume work produced in sequence. There's a medical volume and a surgical volume in each one of these in each set that comes out. And it shows you either through photographs or by his medical illustration, which was a high art until about the 1980s, what various diseases look like when you see them. So you're going to see pictures of gangrene, as you see here. You're going to see what the aftermath of amputations after a battle. Somebody had raised the question, oh, certainly you're kidding about the piles of amputated feet and legs. So somebody took a photograph and published it in the medical and surgical history because they didn't think it was appropriate for the general public to see. But of course, here we can see it. And of course, this continued to go on for a number of years. In addition, this medical and surgical history of the war was going to talk about rehabilitation. And you're going to find in that book a number of the various appliances that they used in order to set a leg, in order to set an arm, in order to take care of wounds in places that are hard to reach and deal with. What happens if you're shot in the stomach? What happens? Well, you can find out a lot about the tools that they used, the instruments that they used. The artificial limb industry becomes a booming one after the Civil War. And an awful lot of what we see today has its roots in the years right after 61, 64, or 65. There were a number of wounds which, of course, were not considered something that you wanted the American people to see. There was something too graphic about some of these wounds to show to the American public, although it's certainly the truest face of war if you ever want to take a look at it. And so what you see here are some of the illustrations of some of the more ghastly wounds. And one of the things that the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion wanted to do was to strip away any notion that there was glory in this war, that this is the reality, and this is what we had to learn how to deal with. Today, even plastic surgeon residents are interested in coming down here and taking a look at some of these injuries that were caused in the Civil War, because frankly, some of the problems are still the same today that you have to deal with. One of the last things, of course, that Hammond would do and leave as a legacy that was made easier by the medical and surgical history of the war is that they paid a great deal of attention to aftercare. Not simply, can we make you healthy enough to leave and go home to your family, but what are the consequences of your wound going to be in the years and the decades to come? And so what you were going to see in some of these books are photographs like this where you get a chance to see not just what happened a year after a wound, but what was happening well down the line. Documenting some of these wounds made it much easier for various veterans to get pensions, disability pensions in their old age. And oftentimes that's why photographs like these were taken. But really what it did was provided even more to the stockpile of information that came out of the Civil War in a very big way. A lot of these photographs you can find in the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, or you can find them as research tools still available to you today if you go down to the museum down in Silver Spring. When the Civil War was over, an awful lot of the surgeons went home. But they went home with a depth and expanse of experience that they could not have foreseen that they would ever gather as younger individuals. And as the younger surgeons of the Civil War get a little bit older and have the opportunity to start spreading their expertise, sharing their expertise with the next generation coming up, that will set the stage for the professionalization of the American medical profession of the 1880s that we were always told was the starting point. We actually have the generation before that, the Civil War generation, to thank for the modern medicine that we would develop in the near future. So we're not just a pile of legs and amputated stumps and things like that left over after a battle of Gettysburg. This is the dawn of hard science, hard medical science in the United States, and there's still much for us to learn about something that we pretty much had already reduced to that pile of legs. Thank you. Warren says I'm allowed to answer a couple questions. I always listen to Warren.
Could you comment on what we saw in the PBS series Mercy Street and maybe put that into context?
I knew that was going to be the first question. I'll be honest. I shut it off after the first episode. Why? Number one, I hated the acting. Okay, but number two, it seemed to be very dedicated. Some things it was getting right. I mean, you got to give them credit for trying to show some of the new things that were coming on the scene, because the good folks at the Medical Museum of the Civil War down in Frederick were working with them. But one of the things, I've been an advisor on things like this before, is they will take your advice up to the point where it interferes with their story, and then they're going to forget about it. And so to the extent that there was some good and useful information in it that no doubt came from the historian side of things, yay, but I'm sorry, I couldn't get past the storyline. And you know, if I got turned off very early, so maybe it turns out fine, but that's being honest. I know as a historian I should have muddled through that thing, but you know, life is too short. So, sir.
I know they didn't know anything about the germ theory of disease, but at least they should have figured out that soldiers that had their wounds cleaned or washed did better than soldiers that didn't have their wounds cleaned. Couldn't they figure out that their surgical instruments, if they had stayed clean and washed and other instruments, they would have done a lot better with their patients?
One would think so, but there were so many things that offered contradictory information. For instance, if you saw a wounded soldier and his wound was covered with maggots, what would you think? This guy's going to die. Except sometimes the maggots were doing a good thing, and they were actually cleaning the wounds, and as long as you finally removed the maggots, they had cleaned the wound and everything was going to work out fine. You mentioned wash them off. That opens up a real intriguing question. Water. There's on a warm day, some of you, I know, took the Pickett's Charge walk earlier in the day, and Troy gave you a workout, and some of you were really happy when that water came along a little bit later. We talk all about hydration today, and water being one of the keys to good health. The Civil War generation was so ill-informed on water and its use that your soldier in the ranks was already being told a number of different things. Early in the war, they told soldiers, do not drink a lot of water. In other words, go ahead and dehydrate yourself. That's actually a good thing. There was a paper, clearly pseudoscience, that was published in New York City in 1861 that was reprinted as a pamphlet that was put in, a handbook for soldiers and actually propagated fairly widely saying, don't drink the water. Then there were others who said, drink the water, but they had certain rules. Now, Surgeon General Hammond, during the Civil War, wrote a book, and it was called Military Hygiene, which is an odd-sounding title because it sounds like it's telling you keep yourself clean. But it was really about anything related to the care of the body, medical care. And it said, basically, that soldiers should drink a lot of water, but it absolutely should not be cold water. And it made it a command responsibility that if you were crossing a creek and your men fell out of line in order to fill their canteens, that you should issue it as an order, a punishable offense, that they were not allowed to drink that water until you had marched at least 1 mile. That would provide time for the water to warm up a little bit, so it would be nice and tepid and not very tasty at all. But then it would be apparently safe to drink. It didn't say anything about make sure the cavalry hasn't just crossed the stream a half a mile up. Nothing about that. But there's an awful lot out there of something as basic as hydration that we sort of take for granted that they don't get. So do they? Yeah, no, they're not really making a connection yet. Now, some of the physicians, especially the ones who have the training in Paris and those who they have contact with back here in the United States, they do know that cleanliness matters. The image, the traditional image that you just took your saw and just wiped it off and went back to the next one is apparently, at least if you read what the physicians were given as sort of guidelines, there are comments in there about make sure that they're washed off. But it doesn't say wash them off in alcohol, and it doesn't say wash them off in whiskey, and it doesn't say anything like that. It goes as far as wash them off. I guess that's the first step, but no, they aren't there yet. It does make a difference that we don't have germ theory yet. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that we don't understand that there's things going on at a very small level beyond which we can see with the naked eye. Hammond was a great believer in the microscope. Over in Paris, he had learned about microscopes. They used them in their labs over there. And he insisted that microscopes be introduced to the American medical community, and he made sure that every one of his major hospitals had a microscope. The microscope was kept under lock and key so that it wouldn't be stolen. There was only 1 or 2 licensed or certified people on each staff that was taught how to use it and had to be present in the room when it was being used. It wasn't looking for, subcellular or anything. It was just trying to get you a better look at what's going on at 1 or 2 levels beyond what you could see with your eyes. They were not looking for bacteria, that sort of thing. Okay. All right, he's going to make me stop now, so thank you. Here we go.